Ned Stark woke before the dawn, as he often did, still kneeling by the weirwood after a night spent praying for guidance. Snow dusted the shoulders of his cloak, and he tried to ignore the cramp in his stiff knees. The old gods, if they had granted him any answer, spoke in riddles he could not unravel. He rose slowly, brushing the powdery snow from his furs, and made his way back through the godswood. His breath misted in the brittle cold. All around him, Winterfell lay in a hush that accompanied the final dark hours before sunrise. A pair of guards nodded at him on the covered walkway leading to the great keep, but neither dared question their lord's early wanderings. He did not sleep well these days. He had not slept well since the discovery of the eggs. The knowledge of 3 living dragons, hatched in secrecy, now hidden north of the wall with Jon, rested on his soul like a boulder poised to tumble. Any day, any hour, a raven might arrive with word that the king or the Lannisters or even some unscrupulous bannerman had learned of the dragon's existence. And in that moment, everything would change. Robert, for all his boisterous affection for Ned, would never suffer Targaryen beasts to live. The realm would tear itself apart in fear. He emerged into the courtyard, acknowledging a stable boy who was beginning his morning tasks. The lad scurried away, looking half-frozen. The sky showed only the faintest light, a hint of gray behind the castle towers. Ned pulled his cloak tight, recalling the swirl of red leaves in the godswood, the hush of ancient branches. He felt closer to the old gods in these moments when his burdens seemed too heavy for any mortal man to bear. Perhaps the weirwood had whispered that Jon was the song of ice and fire, or perhaps Ned had merely conjured those words in his own mind, fearful of the prophecy they implied. In the privacy of his solar, he set about the day's business. There were ledgers to review, letters to compose, petitions from local lords who needed help with disputes over land and sheep. So it went every day. The realm's petty quarrels carried on beneath the grand shadow of winter and the coming darkness beyond the wall. Some part of Ned felt it surreal to be asked to settle an inheritance squabble among minor lords, while out there, in the far north, creatures once thought mythical were flying in the icy winds. But his duty as Warden of the North required him to deal with these smaller matters, even while his heart pounded with dread at the greater threat. He worked until well after sunrise. The maids lit the hearth, warming the solar, and brought him a simple breakfast of porridge and bread. He ate mechanically, eyes never leaving the messages on his desk. One letter was from White Harbor, complaining of ever-growing sea ice that hampered trade. Another, from Torrens Square, described sightings of direwolves in unusual numbers. And there was always a steady trickle of pleas from the Night's Watch, requesting more men, more supplies, more steel. Ned obliged as best he could. He understood that with each month the threat grew. He carefully set aside a small sheaf of parchment to send north. Though none of it mentioned dragons, these coded missives would find their way through certain loyal rangers, eventually reaching Jon. The letters contained updates on the realm's affairs, word of King Robert's location, the latest bickering in King's Landing, and hints of the tensions with the Lannisters. Ned never wrote openly of the dragons, but he guessed Jon would read between the lines. By mid-morning, Catelyn joined him. She wore a heavy cloak of dark blue wool over her gown, her auburn hair bound behind her head. Despite their years of marriage, there remained a certain distance between them whenever the topic of Jon arose. She asked her usual questions about what tidings had come from Castle Black. Ned gave guarded answers. "Lord Commander Mormont thanks us for the latest shipment of provisions," he said carefully. "He also mentions that wildlings have been moving in greater numbers." Catelyn nodded, her mouth a thin line. "Winter is nearing. The wildlings often come south. But there are troubling rumors too. Something about monstrous creatures lurking in the mountains." Ned kept his expression neutral. Frightened travelers see all manner of beasts in their imaginations. The North has enough real dangers. We need not stoke fear with phantom ones. He did not lie precisely, but each half-truth weighed on him. Catelyn studied his face, perhaps sensing that he held something back. Then, as she so often did, she let it lie. They spoke of other things, the tasks for the day, the children, Sansa's letters from the Vale, and how Arya wished to practice archery more often, much to the dismay of Septa Mordain. In an ordinary time, these small domestic matters would have eased Ned's mind, yet now he simply felt a yawning gulf between the normalcy of daily life and the cataclysmic secret he guarded. He decided to take a walk around the ramparts, if only to clear his head. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending swirls of snow across the courtyard. Servants hurried to and fro, carrying wood, hauling water, salting the walkways against ice. Winterfell bustled, as it always did, a living fortress sustained by the hot springs beneath its foundations that had once concealed 3 dormant dragon eggs. Ned gazed across the expanse of white fields beyond the walls, remembering the day he discovered that hidden chamber. A swirl of guilt and pride mingled in his heart. Guilt because he knew the havoc dragons had wrought in the past. Pride because his boy had managed to hatch and raise them, forging a bond that might protect the realm from a far greater threat. He ascended to the top of the gatehouse. From here, he could see the main road, flanked by a few wooden structures and farmland that had gone fallow. The lines of the horizon blurred in the pale winter light. He tried to imagine what Jon was doing at that very moment. Was he seated by a campfire, feeding scraps of meat to the dragons? Soaring overhead on Umbra's back, scanning for signs of the others? Or was he engaged in a skirmish with whites somewhere in the frost-choked wilderness? Ned closed his eyes, letting the chill bite at his cheeks. If the worst came and the others invaded in force, the realm would need to be united behind the cause. Yet if Robert discovered that dragons flew again, and especially if he learned that they answered to Ned's own son, the resulting conflict could tear the 7 kingdoms apart before the first White Walker set foot south of the wall. It was a terrible dilemma, and Ned had no easy answer. Eventually, he descended the ramparts and returned to his duties. A letter waited on his desk, bearing the seal of the Eyrie. It was from Lisa Arryn, long-winded, full of cautionary remarks about the Lannisters, references to possible conspiracies in King's Landing, and pleas for Ned to watch over the Vale's northern passes. Ned knew Lisa's mind had grown fretful and suspicious since her husband's death. She hinted at a million dangers, but not once did she speak of the true threat gathering in the far north. Ned set her letter aside, sighing. He was still at his desk when Robb and Bran burst in, accompanied by Rickon trailing behind. Bran's cheeks were flushed. He still walked with a slight limp from his accident some months earlier, an accident that in the main timeline had been far more severe, but in this twisted turn of fate, it was only a tumble from a wall that left him bruised and battered for some time. Today, however, he wore a bright grin. "Father," Bran said, "Robb wants to ride out on a hunt. He said I might go if you approve." Ned glanced at his sons. It was easy to forget sometimes how young they still were. Robb was nearing manhood, certainly, tall, broad of shoulder. But Bran was still a boy, eager to prove himself, hungry for adventure. Rickon, barely out of the nursery, stared with wide eyes, hoping to go along but not daring to voice it. Ned forced a small smile. "A hunt, is it? In this weather?" Robb shrugged. "The game is scarce, but we can check the woods near the lonely hills. I thought we might flush out some hares or a snow fox. We have hounds enough." Ned considered the dangers. Winter was nearing in earnest. Snow drifts could be treacherous, but refusing might stifle them, and the Starks were not strangers to winter hunts. He gave a reluctant nod. "Very well, but take Theon with you and a party of men. Make sure you are well supplied, and do not wander far. You know how quickly a squall can blow in." Bran looked ready to leap with excitement, but Ned caught him by the shoulder. "Stay close to your brother and do as he says. Theon knows these woods too. Don't let your eagerness lead you astray." Bran nodded seriously, but his grin broke through again. Rickon tugged on Ned's cloak. "Father, can I go too?" Ned knelt to Rickon's level, meeting the boy's pleading gaze. "You're a bit young for a hunt in deep snow, my son. You'll stay here and help your mother. Perhaps next year." Rickon pouted, but Ned ruffled his hair. The older boys departed, buzzing with excitement. Their youthful energy brought a faint warmth to Ned's heart. He wished he could shelter them forever from the truths of the world, dragonfire, White Walkers, and the burdens that overshadowed their father's days. Yet the North was a harsh teacher. Left alone again, Ned found his mind drifting north. Beyond the wall, in that hidden gorge deep in the Frostfangs, Jon Snow crouched beside a steaming vent of sulphurous air, rubbing warmth into his hands. Overhead, the sky was a bleak gray with clouds that threatened more snow. Umbra, his black-scaled dragon, perched on a rocky outcrop nearby, half-dozing yet always vigilant. Frostfire, the pale blue beast, curled in the lee of a boulder, exhaling delicate wisps of cold that formed glittering crystals in the air. Verdant, green as deep summer, soared above the gorge, scanning for prey. Ghost, Jon's direwolf, lay close, ears perked for any sound of danger. Together, they formed an unlikely pack in this desolate wilderness. The dragons had grown significantly in the past months, each large enough to dwarf a warhorse, their wingspans broad and powerful. When they hunted, they could bring down entire herds of aurochs. They were still young, still learning, but their presence had already altered the balance of power among the wildlings. Some tribes fled at the rumor of dragons overhead, while others approached with cautious reverence, calling out to the shadow flame beasts. Jon had done his best to keep the dragons hidden, but secrecy could not last forever. At night, their roars echoed against the mountains. Sometimes, the glow of their fires lit the clouds. Still, few in the civilized South believed such tales, choosing to dismiss them as wildling exaggerations or illusions caused by the aurora. He felt exhausted. Each day brought new challenges. Foraging or hunting to feed creatures that seemed to have bottomless stomachs, scouting the edges of the territory to track the movements of the others, receiving the occasional messenger from the Night's Watch who came bearing news or supplies. The watch itself was fracturing beneath the pressure. Too few men held the wall, and the Lord Commander could only dispatch so many rangers northward. More and more frequently, Jon found himself the sole line of defense for scattered groups of wildlings who encountered whites in the night. He was not entirely alone, though. Some of his black brothers, including Samwell Tarly, PYP, and Gren, had formed a small network of watchers who ensured that if the others moved in force, Jon would know. Mormont had grown more accepting, if still wary, of the dragon's existence, seeing them as a powerful weapon that might serve the living. But there was little direct support the old man could offer, not when the Night's Watch was so thinly stretched. Jon sighed, thinking of the last skirmish he'd faced. A group of White Walkers, 3 tall, gaunt figures with eyes like blue fire, had led a pack of undead bears against a wildling encampment. By chance, Jon and Verdant were hunting nearby. It had been a vicious clash in the gloom, lit only by the dragon's flame. The White Walkers fought with otherworldly grace, their ice weapons capable of parrying even steel, but a blast of Verdant's fire had forced them to retreat. One had been destroyed by Frostfire's chilling breath, the interplay of extreme cold and living ice causing it to crack from within. The other 2 vanished into the swirling snow, leaving the whites to crumble once their animating power fled. In the aftermath, Jon found nothing but corpses, wildlings killed in the assault. It had been too late to save any. The reality of that weighed on him. Even dragons could not be everywhere at once, and the others were testing him, or so he believed, learning his tactics, discovering what these scaled creatures could do. A deep rumble echoed above the gorge, and Jon looked up to see Verdant returning from the hunt, a fresh kill, a large goat, clutched in the dragon's talons. The green beast descended to a ledge, ripping into its prey with savage efficiency. Blood splattered across the stones. Umbra stirred, watching the meal, but made no move to steal it. Jon had learned that each dragon preferred to claim its own food, though they would occasionally share. Frostfire, sensitive to cold though the others might be, often waited for its siblings to finish feeding before creeping in to claim scraps. Jon rose to his feet, fighting the stiffness in his legs. He needed to check the perimeter of the valley and make certain no wildling band or white straggler had slipped in. He would have to walk the route or perhaps ride Umbra if the dragon was willing. Though each of the 3 beasts allowed Jon to climb onto its back, they were still adjusting to the weight and the nuance of carrying a rider. Umbra, the the largest and most aggressive, had made it clear that it would suffer Jon's presence only because of their bond. A lesser man would have been incinerated by now. He approached the black dragon carefully, letting it smell him or sense his warmth. Umbra opened one eye, pupil a slitted ember in the dark orb. A low growl reverberated. "Shall we, boy?" Jon murmured, though he was uncertain if Umbra was male or female. He had yet to learn how to discern such details in dragons. "We need to scout the hills." Umbra shifted, unfolding its wings with a rustle of scaled membrane. Jon took hold of the harness he'd fashioned from boiled leather and rope. It was crude, but it allowed him to keep some balance in flight. He swung a leg over the dragon's flank, settling behind the ridges of its spine. Ghost padded forward, letting out a soft whine. Jon leaned down to ruffle the direwolf's ears. "Stay here, Ghost. Guard the gorge. I'll be back soon." Ghost snorted but sat on his haunches, watching with that eerie red-eyed stare. Then Umbra launched upward in a sudden lurch that nearly sent Jon sprawling. He tightened his grip, heart hammering as a rush of cold air swept over him. The ground dropped away, the rocky walls of the gorge passing in a gray blur. A moment later, they were aloft, wings beating against the sky. No matter how many times he flew, it never ceased to steal Jon's breath. The immensity of the Frostfangs stretched below him, jagged peaks like a sea of teeth, valleys choked with ice and snow. The wind cut at his face, but Umbra's body radiated warmth, enough to keep him from freezing. He guided the dragon with careful pressure from his knees and hands, though it often seemed Umbra followed its own will as much as Jon's. They soared over the gorge, rising higher. Jon looked down to see the faint forms of verdant and frostfire near the steam vents. He urged Umbra to glide north, scanning the horizon for movement. Clouds obscured much of the distance, and the pale light made it difficult to discern friend from foe. Still, he spotted a dark smudge of something, maybe a campfire, far along a ridge. Curious, he signaled Umbra to descend, though the dragon remained cautious, circling high. Jon peered down. Yes, there was a small camp tucked against a rocky outcrop, smoke curling upward. Perhaps wildlings. He had to be wary. Umbra's presence would terrify them, and not without cause. Jon brought the dragon lower, hoping to glean some sign of who they were. He saw figures scurrying, pointing upward. Then, to his shock, one of them lit a torch and waved it wildly. It seemed they were signaling, not running. Jon frowned. He patted Umbra's neck, urging the dragon to remain calm, then angled for a landing spot a short distance away from the camp. The last thing he needed was a confrontation that ended in dragonfire. Umbra's landing kicked up a swirl of snow and loose rock. Jon slid off, adjusting his sword belt. He kept one hand near the hilt of Longclaw, the other raised in a gesture of peace. Umbra hissed, smoke coiling from its nostrils, but did not attack. A trio of wildlings emerged from behind the outcrop. They looked ragged, half-starved, dressed in furs stiff with frost. One was a lanky woman with a spear strapped to her back. Another was a tall man wearing a patchwork cloak. The third was a youth who couldn't have been more than 15. All three had the hard, weathered look of survivors, yet their expressions were filled with something like hope. The tall man stepped forward cautiously. "We heard tales of a dragon rider, a black-cloaked crow who flies with beasts of flame and frost." Jon let out a slow breath, arms still raised. "I'm Jon Snow. I serve the Night's Watch, though not in the usual way." "Who are you?" "Name's Tormund," the man said. His voice carried a hint of wry humor. "Tormund Giantsbane if you like fancy titles. Though I've yet to kill a giant, much as I talk about it." Jon's eyebrows rose. He'd heard of Tormund Giantsbane, a wildling leader supposedly loyal to Mance Rayder. This was no minor encounter. "What brings you out here?" "We're scouts," Tormund replied, gesturing behind him. Mance heard rumors too. "The free folk are stirrin'. They say a man with dragons hunts the others in the Frostfangs. We came to see if it was true. And, well, it's true enough." He eyed Umbra warily. Jon lowered his hands, though he remained on guard. The others are real, Tormund. They grow bolder every day. If you're with Mance, you must know there's no safety beyond the wall. Tormund gave a rough chuckle. We know. Mance wants to bring our people south, away from this dead land. But the crows on the wall bar our path. Now we find you up here, taming monsters out of old tales. Makes a man wonder if an alliance might be possible. Jon studied Tormund's face. The wildling had a genuine, open manner about him, at least compared to the cunning of some free folk. The woman behind him still gripped her spear, and the youth carried a dagger. They looked desperate and cold, not immediate threats. I can't speak for the entire Night's Watch, Jon said eventually, but I know the real enemy is not each other. If Mance truly wants to protect his people from the others, we share a goal. But crossing the wall, that's the rub. Tormund let out a white puff of breath. If your Lord Commander would open the gates, let us through, we'd bend the knee if that's what it takes. Or at least we'd vow not to raid. We just need safety. Jon thought of how Mormont might react. The old bear understood the threat, but he was still bound by oaths and tradition, and the lords of the Seven Kingdoms would never welcome wildlings into their lands. Then again, the lords of the Seven Kingdoms had no notion of how dire the threat truly was. Let's talk, he said, gesturing to the small fire they had made. But first, call out anyone else who might be hiding. I have no wish for an ambush. The woman with the spear snorted. We're not fools, Crow. There's only 3 of us. Slowly, they approached, forming a tense circle around the modest fire pit. Umbra prowled behind Jon, claws scraping on stone. The dragon let out a low, rumbling growl, but Jon murmured a calming word, and it subsided. They spoke for the better part of an hour. Tormund explained that Mance Rayder had gathered thousands of free folk, families, clans, giants, even a few wargs, hoping to break south of the wall before the others could wipe them out. The small group here was meant to confirm the dragon's existence and, if possible, convince the rumored dragon rider to speak on their behalf to the Night's Watch. Jon had no illusions that his voice alone could open the gates to an entire army of wildlings, but he did know that if the others attacked, the free folk would fight or die, and their bodies might rise as wights to bolster the undead ranks. He also knew the wildlings were not the real enemy. Not anymore. Return to Mance, he said at last. Tell him that if he wants peace, he should seek a parley with the Night's Watch. I can't promise we'll let you through, but if the Lord Commander sees the threat is real, he may be willing to consider it. Tormund barked a short laugh. The old bear? He's an honorable sort as crows go, but he's not the only one we need to convince. Your southern kings are blind to what's coming, or so Mance says. Jon could not deny it. They are, but we can't wait for them to awaken. My father rules the north and he knows something of the truth. If need be, I'll send word to him, though we must keep these matters quiet. He didn't mention the dragons to Mance just yet, nor his father's involvement. There were too many dangerous ears, and not all wildlings were Tormund. But he did want to open a path to cooperation. The meeting ended with Tormund and his companions packing their gear. They eyed Umbra nervously as they left, but Tormund offered Jon a surprisingly respectful nod. I hope we meet again without steel drawn, or dragon fire overhead. They vanished into the rocks, heading northward. Jon lingered a moment, staring into the dying embers of their fire. He felt a pang of longing for simpler times, for the days when his greatest worry was whether a noble family might scorn him for being a bastard. Now he was entangled in struggles far beyond the scope of petty court intrigue. The fate of thousands, perhaps millions, hung in the balance. He mounted Umbra again, coaxing the dragon into flight. They soared over the ridge, scanning for any further signs of movement, but the land lay cold and still. The flurries thickened, swirling around them. Jon guided Umbra back to the hidden valley. When they landed, he found Verdant had finished its meal and was curled up in the warmth of a steam vent, while Frostfire prowled the edges of the gorge. Ghost greeted Jon with a soft yip. Jon stoked a small campfire of his own, thoughts churning. If Mance Rayder marched on the wall with thousands of wildlings, the Night's Watch would be forced to respond, and that might spark a slaughter. On the other hand, if Mance remained in the north, the others would slaughter them anyway, adding their ranks to the undead host. Better to risk forging an alliance than to face the White Walkers alone. He knew he had to reach out to Mormont. The Lord Commander might not like it, but these were dire times. The living had to unite or they would fall together. And if that meant revealing the dragons to more of the Night's Watch, so be it. The next morning, Jon packed what few supplies he could carry, mounted Umbra, and began the journey south to Castle Black. He left Verdant and Frostfire behind, instructing them in the only way he could, through gestures, touches, and the intangible bond that had formed between them. They understood, in their own reptilian manner, that they were to remain in the valley and guard it. Ghost stayed behind as well, for the flight would be swift and cold, and Jon needed Umbra unencumbered. The flight took half a day, braving fierce winds and blinding snow. For much of the journey, the world below was a featureless sheet of white. Jon relied on memory, scanning for familiar landmarks. A certain mountain peak, the shape of a winding river. Finally, by late afternoon, he spotted the dark slash of the wall in the distance, rising impossibly high, a barrier of ice that stretched from horizon to horizon. Even from afar, it was an awe-inspiring sight. As he drew closer, Jon angled Umbra into a descent. The watchers on the wall must have seen him. He glimpsed dark figures darting along the ramparts. Horn blasts sounded, hollow and echoing across the snowfield. He prayed they would not loose arrows in blind panic. He had given instructions to a few allies, PYP, Gren, Sam, to expect him, but not every brother of the Watch was in on the secret. The enormous gates at Castle Black remained shut, but the courtyard bustled with frantic activity. Jon guided Umbra to land outside the main walls, in an open stretch of snow-swept ground. The dragon's impact shook the earth, and more than a few black-cloaked figures scattered in alarm. Jon dismounted carefully, raising both hands, hoping to forestall any rash reactions. Umbra hissed, its head swiveling to take in the sight of so many men. A contingent of armed rangers approached, swords and crossbows at the ready. Leading them was Ser Alliser Thorne, his perpetually sour expression replaced by outright shock. He glared at Jon, then at Umbra, as if his mind could scarcely reconcile the enormous black-scaled beast with the boy he'd once tormented. "What in the name of the seven hells?" Ser Alliser began, voice trembling despite his attempts to sound stern. Before Jon could reply, another voice boomed across the courtyard. "Stand down, Thorne!" The rangers parted, revealing Lord Commander Mormont striding forward. His breath misted in the frigid air, and his eyes flicked to Umbra with a mixture of wariness and grudging respect. He wore a thick bearskin cloak, and at his side loomed the old steward, Bowen Marsh. Thorne spat on the ground but lowered his sword, though many of the men still had crossbows aimed. They seemed uncertain whether to obey. Mormont stopped a dozen paces from Jon and the dragon. Umbra let out a low rumble, black smoke drifting from its nostrils. Jon spoke first, his voice echoing in the hush. "Lord Commander, I've returned. We must talk." Mormont glanced at the crossbowman. "Lower your weapons," he barked. "If this beast meant us harm, half of us would be ash by now. You boy, get me a barrel of salt fish from the stores. I suspect we might need an offering to keep that thing calm." A flurry of confusion followed as the men rushed to obey. Thorne stood there with a clenched jaw, his eyes flicking between Mormont and Jon. Eventually, he sheathed his sword. "I'll have no part in this madness," he muttered, stalking away. Mormont waited until the courtyard began to clear. A few curious onlookers remained at a safe distance, drawn by the spectacle of a living dragon. Samwell Tarly appeared from the shadows, wide-eyed but seemingly relieved that Jon had arrived safely. Gren and PYP were there as well, exchanging astonished glances. "Walk with me," Mormont said to Jon in a low voice, "and keep your beast under control if you can." "I'll try." Jon turned to Umbra and placed a hand on the dragon's neck. He whispered softly, though he wasn't sure how much Umbra truly understood. "Easy, boy. Stay. Umbra shifted, tail lashing, but made no move to attack. The fish arrived, and the men hesitantly rolled the barrel closer. Umbra lifted its head, sniffed, and then tore into the salted fish with a voracious snarl. Bits of brine and scales flew, prompting the watchers to scramble back. Jon followed Mormont toward the gate, passing through the heavy wooden doors into Castle Black's courtyard. Even here, men lined the battlements, gawking. The sight of a black dragon devouring fish outside the walls was something none of them had ever imagined. In the Lord Commander's solar, the air was marginally warmer, thanks to a roaring fire. Mormont gestured for Jon to sit. Then he took his own seat behind a stout wooden table. His raven perched above him, croaking, "Snow, snow," in a gravelly voice. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Mormont rubbed his temple, letting out a weary sigh. "If I hadn't seen that beast with my own eyes, I'd say you were lying." Jon removed his gloves, flexing stiff fingers. "I wish it were a lie, my lord. But you've known the truth for some time now. I've heard your reports. Hard to swallow them, but I believed enough to let you continue this arrangement." Mormont's gaze sharpened. "Why return now? The risk is great. You could have been shot from the sky." "Because the situation has changed," Jon said, meeting the older man's eyes. "The wildlings have a massive host gathering under Mansraider, planning to push south. They fear the others as much as we do. I met Tormund Giantsbane and his scouts in the Frostfangs. They want a parley." Mormont let out a grunt. "A parley? Mance wants us to open the gate, I suppose?" "He wants his people to survive," Jon said quietly. "The others are picking them off. If they remain beyond the wall, they'll die. And every one that dies might become a white. That means when the others march, we'll face thousands more of the dead. Bringing them south might be the only way to keep them from swelling the enemy's ranks." Mormont's raven hopped along the chair, muttering, "Dead, dead." The Lord Commander drummed his fingers on the table. "I've heard these arguments before, from you and from others, but letting the wildlings pass, that's a decision bigger than Castle Black. The lords of the realm would never allow it, especially not if they suspect the wildlings might raid or rebel." "They might not have a choice," Jon said. "If the others come in force, the realm will need every living soul to fight on the side of the living. Or else we lose. Dragons alone can't hold back an endless tide of the dead." Mormont studied him, brows furrowed. "How many of these creatures do you have, truly?" "3. The other 2 are hidden in the Frostfangs, Verdant and Frostfire. Umbra is the largest, and even that one is barely more than a hatchling by dragon standards." The older man exhaled slowly. "And they answer to you?" Jon hesitated. "They trust me, or they tolerate me. I've raised them since they hatched under Winterfell. There is a bond, though I don't pretend to understand it fully." Mormont nodded, as though that confirmed some suspicion. He stared into the fire. "And your father? He knows, I assume." Jon felt his chest tighten. "He does. Lord Stark discovered the eggs, and he entrusted me with them. He understands the danger if word spreads. King Robert would demand they be destroyed." "Robert Baratheon is a stubborn fool," Mormont muttered. "But I can't say I blame him for his hatred of Targaryen relics. The last dragons brought war and devastation." Jon recalled the lessons. King Aerys' madness, Rhaegar's rebellion, the Fields of Fire centuries earlier. "I know, but these are different times. The war that's coming is not one of men against men, but life against death." Mormont's posture slumped. "And so it falls to the Night's Watch to adapt. Very well. I'll consider meeting with Mansraider. But I warn you, Jon, many of our brothers won't accept it. We've fought the free folk for generations. Bringing them south, that's treason in some eyes." "I'll do what I must," Jon said, voice steady. "Even if it means fighting my own brothers. The real enemy is out there in the cold." A grim smile tugged at Mormont's lips. "It warms my old heart to see such conviction in a younger man. I only pray you're right about this alliance, and that you can keep those dragons under control." The last thing we need is to burn half the north to cinders. Jon felt a stab of anxiety. Umbra was not easily controlled, let alone the other two. I do my best. They learn quickly. Mormont pushed himself to his feet, hand on the small of his back. Then get some rest. I'll arrange for a quiet council with my senior officers. We'll keep your presence and that black monster outside the gate as secret as we can. Though I doubt we can hide it for long. Jon nodded. As he rose, Mormont gripped his arm, a fierce light in the old man's eyes. We stand on a knife's edge, Jon Snow. One slip and the realm falls into chaos. Tread carefully. I will, Lord Commander. Thank you. Outside, the afternoon sky was turning into a flat steel color. Umbra had finished its meal and prowled restlessly near the gate, tail lashing, leaving deep gouges in the snow. A handful of watchers stood on the walls, their faces pale. Jon hurried to calm the dragon, whispering soothing words, stroking the ridges of its neck. Umbra's eyes glowed with an inner fire, as though the cold winds only stoked its feral spirit. Jon guided Umbra to a secluded corner by the wall's base, where the ground sloped away from the main courtyard. There, an old stable once used for storing battered wagons might serve as partial shelter. He coaxed the dragon inside, or as far as it would go. Umbra snapped at the low rafters, which creaked ominously. Jon sighed. He would have to keep watch himself, to ensure the dragon did not break free and rampage. He settled into a corner, dropping onto a bale of straw. The door was open to the wind, and the meager roof offered scant protection from the cold. Yet it was better than the open air. Umbra snorted, a thin trickle of smoke escaping its nostrils. Jon dozed, exhaustion overcoming him. At some point, Samwell Tarly found him and offered a warm cloak, a chunk of bread, and a flask of hot tea. Sam stared at the dragon with equal parts fear and fascination. Umbra eyed him warily, but did not attack. "7 hells, Jon?" Sam whispered, trembling as he sank onto another bale of straw. "It's real. All those times you wrote about it, I believed you, but seeing it up close." Jon managed a tired smile. "I know. It's overwhelming at first." Sam swallowed hard, glancing at Umbra's razor teeth. "Lord Commander Mormont asked me to gather some old records. He wants to know about any pacts with wildlings or historical precedents. I suspect he's trying to see if there's a way to justify letting them pass." Jon nodded. "We'll need every precedent we can muster. The Southern Lords won't be pleased if the wall opens, but maybe with the right words we can persuade them." Sam let out a nervous laugh. "You know me, Jon. Books and words are about all I can offer, but I'll do my best." He peered at Umbra again. "Does it speak to you?" "Not with words," Jon said, gaze shifting to the dragon's ember eyes. "It's more like a sense, a pull inside me when it's angry or hungry or curious. Sometimes we see glimpses of each other's thoughts, or so it feels. I can't explain it well." Sam gulped. "That's wondrous." They lapsed into silence. Jon ate the bread, sipping the hot tea gratefully. Through the open door, he watched the sky darken. Nightfall was coming, and with it, the creeping fear that the others might be on the move somewhere out there. He prayed that Verdant and Frostfire would guard the gorge, and that no White Walker would slip past them. Eventually, Sam left to return to his tasks. Jon tried to sleep again, but Umbra's restless movements shook the stable, making it impossible. Finally, he rose, stepping out into the courtyard, letting the cold air jolt him awake. He walked along the perimeter until he reached one of the watchtowers overlooking the gate. From that vantage, he could see across the snowfield where Umbra had landed. Now, only churned drifts and faint fish remains hinted at the earlier spectacle. He gazed north, where the icy expanse stretched endlessly. A bitter wind ruffled his cloak. In the distance, he thought he saw flickering lights, perhaps torches or illusions conjured by swirling snow. The realm felt precariously balanced on a needle's point. Dragons in the north, a massive wildling host assembling, the others stirring in the dead of night. And all the while, the lords of the 7 kingdoms slept, ignorant of the doom that might soon be unleashed. A voice behind him startled him from his thoughts. "Snow!" He turned to see Ser Alistair Thorne standing at the top of the tower's stairs. The man's face was drawn in harsh lines, his lips thin, his eyes burning with resentment. "Ser Alistair." Jon inclined his head, guarded. Thorne stepped closer, his gloved hands resting on the hilt of his sword, though he made no overt threat. His breath steamed in the cold. "I never liked you, Snow, a bastard boy with too much pride. But I tolerated you because the Watch needed men." Jon stiffened, saying nothing. "Now you bring a demon out of old Valyria to Castle Black. You treat with wildlings. You talk of letting them pass." Thorne's voice was low and full of scorn. "You would betray every oath the Night's Watch stands for." "I do what I must," Jon said quietly. "The true enemy is out there, and we need every ally we can find." "Bah!" Thorne's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "You speak like a green boy with illusions in his head. Dragons, White Walkers, all of it is madness. The Watch stands to guard the realm against wildlings, and that's what we'll do. If Mormont's gone senile, if you and your monstrous pet undermine our vows, then perhaps we need new leadership." Jon's heartbeat quickened. "Is that a threat?" Thorne bared his teeth in a humorless smile. "The men talk. They're frightened. Fear leads to anger. If you push them too far, if you push me too far, you'll find we can be as dangerous as any other." A cold fury coiled within Jon, but he fought to keep his voice steady. "Lord Commander Mormont is no senile old fool. He sees the larger truth. If you can't, Ser Alistair, then you're the one betraying the Watch's purpose, to protect the realm of men from what lies beyond." Thorne's mouth twitched. "I'd rather face 1,000 whites than see the day a bastard and his dragon decide how we keep our vows." Jon said nothing. The tension crackled between them, almost tangible in the freezing air. Then Thorne let out a short laugh, turned on his heel, and descended the stairs. Jon's hands shook. Thorne was dangerous. A man who thrived on fear and resentment, quick to stoke the fires of mutiny. If he swayed enough Black brothers to his side, this fragile plan could collapse. Mormont could lose command, or worse, the Watch could tear itself apart from within. He stared northward again, trying to steady his breathing. The wind howled, as though mocking the petty human conflicts that might overshadow the real war. Jon gripped the stone parapet until his knuckles turned white. So many threats, so many burdens. Eventually, he made his way back to Umbra, the stable-turned-dragon lair. A few torchlit silhouettes of watchmen tracked his progress from the walls, no doubt fearful that the dragon might attack at any moment. Jon posted himself near Umbra's flank, determined to stand guard through the night if necessary. He rested his back against the dragon's warm scales, letting the steady rise and fall of its breathing lull him into a half-sleep. Visions flitted rough his mind, dreams of a snow-covered battlefield, where the others clashed with living men under swirling skies. He saw wildlings kneeling at the wall, children crying for mercy. He saw Robert Baratheon's face twisted in rage at the sight of dragons. He saw Ned Stark, standing before a heart tree with sorrow in his eyes. And he saw a woman with silver-gold hair, someone he did not know but recognized all the same, holding 3 dragon eggs in a blazing pyre. When dawn broke, it brought little light to the gloom, only a weak gray that illuminated swirling snowflakes. Jon rose stiffly, finding Umbra awake and alert, watching him with slitted pupils. The day passed in tense meetings. Mormont called a council of the senior officers minus Ser Alistair Thorne, who was pointedly excluded, likely to prevent disruption. Men like Bowen Marsh, Othel Yarwick, and a few others gathered in a small chamber near the library. Jon stood at Mormont's side, carefully explaining the necessity of parleying with Mance Rayder. Bowen Marsh, always cautious, fretted about a wildling invasion. Yarwick worried about the reaction of the Southern Lords if they learned the Watch had forsaken its ancient duty. Some recognized that a greater threat overshadowed all. They had heard the rumors of White Walkers. They had seen men vanish on rangings without a trace. They had begun to suspect that the old tales were not mere superstition, and the presence of Jon's dragon outside the gates underscored that the impossible had become real. In the end, Mormont prevailed upon them to at least consider the parley. "Better to meet Mance Rayder and hear him," the Lord Commander said in a gravelly tone, "than to guess his intentions from behind the wall. If we must fight, so be it. But we'll talk first." Bowen Marsh's face remained pinched. "And what of the dragon? Do we hide it? Men who come north of the wall will see the tracks, smell the scorched earth." Jon spoke up. "I'll keep Umbra away from the parley, so as not to frighten them into hostilities. But we can't hide it forever. Sooner or later, the realm will know dragons are here." A somber silence followed. The men glanced at each other, weighed down by the enormity of that statement. Dragons had shaped the history of Westeros, conquered kingdoms, forged dynasties. Now, a single black beast crouched outside the walls of Castle Black, overshadowing the proud traditions of the Watch. When the meeting adjourned, Mormont commanded that a small party would ride out in 3 days to meet Mance. Jon would accompany them. Ravens would be sent to the other castles along the wall, summoning reinforcements should the wildlings attempt an ambush. Meanwhile, news of the dragon was to be kept as quiet as possible, though the rumor mill was already churning. Jon returned to the stable to find Umbra curled in slumber, the warm scales radiating a comfortable heat. He sank to the floor, exhausted by the arguments, the looming threat of Thorn, and the weight of everything that must happen. It felt as if the world was balancing on the edge of a sword. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, though his dreams remained haunted. Days later, on a morning as cold as the grave, a small column of Black brothers rode out from Castle Black, led by Lord Commander Mormont. Jon rode beside him, dressed in furs and black wool, Longclaw at his hip. Umbra flew overhead, out of sight of the main party, hopefully far enough to avoid startling the wildlings. Jon had coaxed the dragon to follow at a distance, though controlling Umbra's flight patterns was never a simple matter. They traveled along the western edge of the wall, passing through a gate near the Shadow Tower to meet with Mance's envoys in neutral ground. Snow blew in blinding gusts, making the journey slow. The men muttered that the gods themselves were trying to prevent this meeting. But eventually they reached a broad expanse of flat tundra bordered by a line of stunted trees, where Mance's scouts had said they would meet. A ring of wildlings awaited them, bristling with spears and axes. At their center stood Mance Rayder himself, a lean man with keen eyes, wrapped in furs as though he were a simple clansman. Tormund Giantsbane was there too, and others like Rattleshirt who wore a grinning skull mask. The tension was palpable. The Night's Watch formed their own line, hands near swords, eyes scanning for an ambush. Jon remained close to Mormont. He sensed a flicker of caution from Umbra overhead, though the dragon stayed high among the low clouds, hidden from most human eyes. Mance stepped forward. His face held no smile, only grim determination. "Lord Commander, you came." Mormont grunted. "So I did. Let us speak plainly, Rayder. You want south of the wall. Why?" "Because of them," Mance said, pointing northward. "The others grow bolder by the day. My people cannot stand against them. We have women, children, old folk. If we remain, we die." "You could scatter," Mormont suggested, though he sounded unconvinced. "Hide in small groups, or retreat deeper into the wastes." Mance shook his head. "There is nowhere to hide. The Frostfangs are crawling with whites. The lakes are frozen and haunted by things that move beneath the ice. We have thousands of souls who will starve or freeze if not butchered by the dead. No, we must pass the wall, and soon." Tormund cleared his throat. "We heard you've got a crow who rides a dragon. If that's true, maybe you can burn the others to cinders. But you can't be everywhere, can you? And you've only one beast." Mormont's expression hardened. "I don't know where you heard such rumor." Mance's lips twitched. "Your secret is not well kept, Lord Commander. Our scouts have seen the black shape in the sky, the fire in the Frostfangs." He turned his gaze to Jon. "You're the one Tormund met. Jon Snow, is it? The crow with the monster on a leash." Jon stepped forward, ignoring the ripple of tension. It's not on a leash, but yes, I have a dragon. Rattleshirt barked a laugh that had no humor. And we're supposed to trust you with that beast at your back? Jon set his jaw. We didn't bring it here to threaten you. We came to talk. The others are our enemy. The Watch can't fight them alone. Neither can you. A muttering spread through the wildlings, many glancing around nervously. Mance raised a hand for silence. And what will the crows want in return? We're not so foolish as to believe you'd simply open the gates out of kindness. Mormont exchanged a glance with Jon. We want your word. You'll not raid south. You'll not harm the people of the north. You'll come peacefully, settle in the Gift or wherever we can arrange, and prepare to stand against the others if they come. Prepare to stand alongside the crows, you mean? Tormund asked. Mormont said. Fight with us, not against us. Mance studied them a long moment, his expression unreadable. I can't speak for every clan or tribe, but if that's the price for crossing the wall, then yes, we'll bend the knee if we must, or whatever symbolic nonsense you want. Better that than watching our children rise as whites in the cold. A hush followed. Jon saw the relief flicker in Mormont's eyes. This was a monumental step, yet it was only words easily broken. The distrust on both sides ran deep. At length, Mormont nodded. We'll need time to arrange safe passage and living quarters. The High Lords in the south don't give a fig for the free folk, Rattleshirt growled. Mormont's face hardened again. True enough, but you have no choice. I'll send word to Winterfell. Lord Stark will do what he can to help. But you must come in peace, or all of this is for nothing. Mance frowned. If your Stark is as honorable as they say, perhaps he'll see reason. When do we move? We'll have to organize it. Perhaps in a fortnight, maybe less. The weather is cruel. Mance and Mormont continued hashing out details while Tormund and Jon exchanged a few words. The big wildling clapped Jon on the shoulder, careful not to spook the other Black brothers. You did well, Crow. Maybe we'll all be breathing by spring. Maybe not. Jon forced a grin. We'll do our best. Just keep your people from killing my brothers if you see them. And I'll try to keep the dragon out of your hair. Tormund chuckled. Deal. The negotiations dragged on until the light grew dim, but they reached a tentative accord. A mass migration of wildlings under the oversight of the Night's Watch. Mance would bring his host near the wall, and Mormont would open a section of the gates. Once all parties confirmed there was no threat of immediate violence. It was precarious, fraught with potential betrayal. But it was something. When the meeting ended, Mance and his party departed into the whirling snow, heading north to spread the news among the free folk. The Night's Watch men breathed a collective sigh of relief, though tension still weighed heavily. On the ride back, Mormont spoke softly to Jon. We're risking a mutiny from within our own ranks, not to mention the fury of the Southern Lords when they learn we've allowed wildlings through. I hope your father can calm those waters. Otherwise, we might face an even bigger war. Jon grimaced. If the Southern Lords refuse, they'll face the others eventually. And by then, half the wildlings could be whites. Mormont's raven perched on the old man's shoulder, squawking, Whites! Whites! Mormont said. That's the truth of it. They reached the wall without incident, and for a time the plan moved forward. Ravens soared to the Night Fort, Eastwatch, and the other fortresses, relaying orders to prepare for the wildlings. Mormont penned a letter to Ned Stark, explaining the circumstances and begging for his support. Jon insisted on adding a personal note in the margin, urging his father to gather the Northern Bannermen in readiness for the real war. Meanwhile, Umbra grew restless, prowling the perimeter of Castle Black and occasionally taking short flights that rattled the watchers on the walls. Jon tried to keep the dragon fed, but the local game was scarce. He worried that if Umbra hungered too long, it might look upon the Black brothers as prey. Fortunately, Mormont arranged some hunts, and the men dragged back a few stags and boars, which Umbra devoured in messy displays. As the days wore on, rumors spread among the Watch. Some rangers argued that the dragon was a sign that the old powers of the world were returning. Others whispered that it was an omen of doom, that the Targaryens were cursed, and anyone allied with them would face ruin. A few men, loyal to Ser Alliser Thorne, muttered darkly that Jon Snow had bewitched the Lord Commander, leading them all into folly. Jon felt these tensions swirling around him. He found it difficult to sleep, worried about a knife in the dark. Even Gren and PYP told him that some men were speaking of sabotage, or of killing the dragon to save the Watch from Jon's madness. But Mormont stood firm, stationing loyal men near Umbra at all times. One stormy afternoon, a column of wildlings approached the wall, a small advance party to test the new arrangement. They huddled near the gates, dwarfed by the towering ice. The Watch opened it cautiously, letting them trickle through. The wildlings trembled, wide-eyed, as they entered Castle Black. Many had never seen the wall so close, nor the huge compound south of it. The Black brothers, for their part, eyed them with silent distrust. Jon aided in directing them to an enclosed yard where they could camp temporarily. He saw women with hollow cheeks, children clinging to their mothers. The men wore a patchwork of scavenged gear. They looked half-starved. Mormont had them fed what meager rations the Watch could spare, storing them under guard for the night. "It's a start," Jon said to Sam, who stood by with a quill, taking notes of each wildling's name or clan. "Soon, we'll have thousands more, if Mance keeps his word." Sam shivered, adjusting his thick cloak. "How will we feed them? The Watch barely has enough supplies for ourselves." Jon glanced at a line of battered tents. "I don't know. Maybe the North can send shipments. Winterfell has strong harvests stored. White Harbor might help. We'll need to arrange it." They continued working late into the night, finishing an inventory of the free folk who had arrived. Once done, Jon made his way to check on Umbra. The stable was lit by a single flickering torch, casting dancing shadows on the dragon's scales. Umbra hissed softly, smoke curling from its jaws. Jon crouched beside it, murmuring reassuring words, telling Umbra about the day's events, as though the creature might understand. In the half-light, the dragon's eyes seemed to glow with a deep, ancient knowledge. A scraping sound caught Jon's attention. He stood, hand on Longclaw's hilt. From the corner of the stable emerged Ser Alliser Thorne, a torch in one hand, a dagger in the other. Two men wearing black cloaks trailed behind him. Their expressions were grim. "Snow," Thorne said, voice taut. "Step away from that beast." Jon's pulse thundered. "What is this?" "We've come to end this madness," Thorne spat. "You and your dragon have brought an invasion of wildlings to our doorstep, turned the Watch from its duty. Sel's words, bastards, traitors. You'll be the end of us all, unless we stop you." Jon saw the tension in the other men's faces. One had a crossbow aimed in his direction. The other clutched a spear. Umbra sensed the hostility, letting out a menacing rumble, steam rising from its jaws. "You'd commit murder here in Castle Black?" Jon asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The Lord Commander is blind?" Thorne barked. "Or bewitched by your damned dragon. This ends now. Step aside or we'll kill you both." Jon knew there was no stepping aside. If Umbra was killed, the Watch would lose a powerful weapon, and the realm would lose a vital defense. More than that, Jon felt a surge of protectiveness. The dragon was not merely a tool, it was bound to him and he to it. He drew Longclaw. "I can't let you do that." Thorne's face twisted. "Then you die, Snow." He lunged forward with the dagger, the blade gleaming in the torchlight. Jon parried, steel clashing. The sound spooked Umbra, who let out a roar that shook the stable. In that instant, the man with the crossbow fired. The bolt flew wild, burying itself in a wooden post. Umbra's tail lashed, sending the spearman flying into a stack of crates. Jon shoved Thorne back, the older knight cursing as he staggered. Umbra reared up, mouth opening in a billow of smoke. Thorne's eyes widened in sheer terror. "No!" Jon shouted, fearing a blast of flame might burn the entire stable and half of Castle Black. He dashed forward, grappling with Thorne, knocking the dagger aside. Another crossbow bolt whistled past, narrowly missing them both. The bowman cursed and tried to reload, hands shaking. Thorn snarled, swinging a gauntlet fist at Jon's face. Jon took the blow on his shoulder, wincing. He slammed the pommel of Longclaw into Thorn's gut, doubling him over. Then he snatched up the torch that Thorn had dropped, whirling to face the bowman. "Drop it," Jon ordered, but the man's eyes flicked to Umbra, who advanced with a scraping of talons. A wet stain spread across the bowman's breeches as he panicked. In desperation, he raised the crossbow once more. Umbra let out a shriek, exhaling a short blast of flame. The resulting burst set the crossbowman ablaze, his screams echoing in the enclosed space. Jon recoiled in horror. The man fell to the ground, thrashing, and Umbra's fire consumed him in seconds. Thorn, still gasping, struggled to his feet. He saw the bowman's fate, eyes wild with fear. "You see?" he spat at Jon. "A monster, just like you." Jon lifted Longclaw, conflict raging inside him. He did not want to kill Thorn, a sworn brother, but the man had all but declared open mutiny. "Ser Alliser, stand down. Surrender your weapons, and I'll—" But Thorn lunged again, sword flashing, apparently recovered from the earlier blow. Jon parried, their blades ringing. Umbra roared, shaking the stable. Sparks rained from the rafters. Thorn fought with a fervor born of hatred, forcing Jon back step by step. In the corner, the spearman groaned, half buried under splintered crates, presumably out of the fight. At last, Jon found an opening. He sidestepped a lunge and cracked Thorn's wrist with the flat of Longclaw. The sword clattered to the ground. Jon hooked a foot under it and kicked it away. Gasping, Thorn reached for his dagger, but Jon slammed him against the wall, pressing the blade of Longclaw to his throat. "Don't," Jon growled, breathing ragged. Thorn's eyes burned with undimmed rage. "Finish it, then. Murder me, as your dragon murdered him." He nodded toward the charred corpse on the floor. Jon felt disgust swirl in his stomach. Disgust for this bloodshed within the Watch. "I don't want to kill you, Ser Alliser, but you tried to kill me and the dragon. You left me no choice." Before Thorn could reply, men burst into the stable. Rangers, stewards, a cluster of black brothers roused by the noise. They froze at the sight of the carnage, the swirling smoke, the black dragon looming, and Jon holding Thorn at sword point. Mormont pushed through them, eyes blazing. "What is the meaning of this?" Jon lowered Longclaw, stepping back. "Ser Alliser attacked me, wanted to kill the dragon." A ragged hush fell. Thorn slumped against the wall, massaging his wrist, glaring at Jon. "I only did what must be done," he muttered. Mormont's gaze swept over the charred corpse, the battered spearman moaning in the corner, and the entire ruin of the stable. "Enough!" he roared. "This is mutiny, Thorn. You'd raise steel against a brother of the Watch, and the only weapon we have against the others." "It's not a weapon," Thorn hissed. "It's an abomination." Mormont's face hardened like iron. "Take him. Bind him. He'll answer for this before the assembled Watch." Several men stepped forward, grabbing Thorn. He did not resist, though he spat curses at Jon. "The day will come when you regret sparing me, bastard," he warned. "I'll see you and your black beast thrown into the ice." Jon exhaled, feeling faint. The men dragged Thorn away. Mormont ran a hand over his brow. "Someone clean up this mess," he ordered, voice shaking with anger. "Gods, Jon, are you all right?" Jon nodded wearily, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm fine, but that poor man, Umbra burned him alive." Mormont glanced at the smoldering remains. "He brought it on himself, I suppose." Yet the horror in his voice was clear. "We can't stay here. This tension will tear us apart." Thorn's not alone in his thinking. Jon looked at Umbra, who was trembling with pent-up aggression, smoke swirling from its jaws. "What do we do?" Mormont set his jaw. "We proceed with the plan. The wildlings will come. We'll guide them through. But you, Snow, you should return to the Frostfangs or somewhere you can keep that dragon away from the bulk of the watch. We'll send you word if we need you. Thorne's supporters might try again, and next time, I might not be able to stop them." Jon swallowed hard, glancing around at the black-cloaked faces. Some showed sympathy, others fear, and a few even a flicker of hatred. He realized that as long as he remained here with Umbra, the Watch was in danger of open revolt. "All right," Jon said hoarsely. "I'll go back north, but I beg you, keep your men from harming the wildlings. If we fail to unite, we'll die." Mormont nodded. I'll do my best. Take what supplies you need. Go quickly." As the men cleared the stable, Jon took a moment to calm Umbra, stroking the dragon's neck. The beast quivered, still riled from the fight. Jon whispered apologies for the chaos, though he was uncertain if Umbra even comprehended. Slowly, he gathered his gear, fitted the harness onto the dragon, and, before dawn broke, led it outside the gates. The rising wind stung his cheeks. He mounted Umbra, scanning the snowy courtyard one last time. Mormont stood on the battlements, raising a hand in a salute. Jon saluted back, then spurred Umbra into the sky. With a powerful downbeat of its wings, the dragon rose, leaving Castle Black behind in the swirling snow. Once again, Jon turned his face to the frozen north, where Verdant and Frostfire awaited him. Tormund had spoken of thousands of free folk gathering for the migration. The others lurked in the darkness, massing an undead army. And at Castle Black, a fragile alliance teetered, threatened by internal strife and external doom. Jon flew on, the clouds closing around him. Far, far away, beyond the southern horizon, Ned Stark worked in secret to prepare the North for the unimaginable. And in a distant land across the sea, rumors whispered of a silver-haired queen who might also command dragons. The tides of fate converged, a swirl of ice and fire about to shape the destiny of Westeros. All that remained to be seen was whether these few sparks of defiance could hold back the long night, whether the bond between a bastard-turned-dragon rider and his 3 living beasts might be enough to stem the darkness. High above the tundra, Umber roared, the sound echoing among the snowy peaks, a challenge hurled at the silent gloom. And Jon Snow, son of ice and fire, closed his eyes against the stinging wind, praying that the old gods and the new would grant them enough time to save the realm from the shadows that crept ever closer, day by day, breath by breath.